Opponents. Joining me now, Democratic Congressman Raja Krishnamoorthi of Illinois, a member of the House Intelligence Committee, Yamiche Alcindor, White House correspondent for the PBS NewsHour, Josh Letterman, NBC News national political reporter, and former U.S. Attorney Joyce Vance. Thank you all for being with us. Well, Congressman, let me just start with you on this news. In the last hour, we read from the statement there, Mick Mulvaney is saying there was no quid pro quo. This aid was not held up for anything to do with the server, the 2016 campaign. You heard what he said earlier. Can you square those two statements in any way?
No, I think that he was telling us what really happened in a candid moment earlier today, and it was a brazen admission. It wasn't just an admission. It was one of those, deal with it, get over it types of issues. And so I think that's really what happened. It really resembles that text exchange back between, I think Sondland and Taylor. Remember when Taylor says, are you conditioning the military aid based on political investigations? And he says, call me. And then he comes up with some answer later on. This is the type of situation that leads one to believe that there's more there in the whistleblower complaint. And we need to pursue this investigation as vigorously as possible at this point.
Yamiche, take us behind the scenes, if you will. Was the White House ready for Mulvaney to come out and say what he did this afternoon, or did he take them by surprise with that? And then what happened between that statement this afternoon and what he's now saying tonight?
Mick Mulvaney's briefing was a surprise addition to the White House's schedule today, and it was pretty surprising for him to say that out on the podium today, saying that, in fact, President Trump was interested in getting information on the DNC and wanted to pressure Ukraine to get that for in exchange for military aid. Now, after Mick Mulvaney said that, there was a lot of backlash, including inside the Trump administration. I had a senior Department of Justice official say to me, we had no idea what Mick Mulvaney's talking about. The DOJ is not aware of any sort of withholding of military aid that has anything to do with the DOJ investigation. Then you have Rudy Giuliani. I was texting with him. He said, I also have no idea what Mick Mulvaney is talking about. So in that span of time, Mick Mulvaney was really getting pushback from people close to President Trump. Then he came out with a statement to try to reverse himself. The problem with Mick Mulvaney's statement is that we have him on camera. So now what you have is the acting chief of staff really saying contradictory things that make President Trump look as though he was really going after a quid pro quo. So the way that this White House usually functions, someone usually gets punished for that. I'm not saying that he's going to lose his job, but I can imagine that the president is very angry with the performance of Mick Mulvaney today.
And Joyce Vance, you also had that statement from the president's outside attorney, from Jay Sekulow, also trying to create distance with what Mick Mulvaney had said this afternoon. What did you make of that?
So I make of the distance that Sekulow is trying to create, much like what I make of the distance others are now trying to create. Everyone knows that this was a bombshell. There are some things that you just can't unsee once they happen. Mulvaney acknowledging publicly that there's a quid pro quo and telling people to deal with it had such a ring of truth to it. Prosecutors are used to dealing with contradictory statements. Mulvaney speaks candidly, not really thinking about it deliberately. It has the ring of truth. And then later we have this carefully crafted effort to walk it back. It's pretty clear which one of those statements has the ring of truth to it. And now Sekulow and everyone else will try to find some way to distance themselves, because what they don't want to have to do is start to defend the fact that there was a quid pro quo. They've got so much stake built up in defending the fact that there wasn't one. It's hard to defend a quid pro quo here because it's a crime.
Well, Trump's push for Ukraine to investigate a discredited conspiracy theory about 2016 was the first of two requests he made of President Zelensky. The other was for dirt on Democratic frontrunner Joe Biden and his son Hunter. Yet Mulvaney tried today to strike a difficult balance, insisting that the freeze on military support was only linked to one and not the other.
So you would say that it's fine to ask about the DNC, but not about Biden?
That did not happen here. No, but I would ask you...
No. On the call, the president did ask about investigating the Bidens. Are you saying that the money that was held up, that had nothing to do with Biden?
No, the money held up had absolutely nothing to do with Biden.
Yeah, Josh, again, confusion here just based on where the day is ending in terms of the statement from Mulvaney. But this afternoon, it sounded like he was trying to create a distinction, sort of saying there's a legitimate quid pro quo, if you're talking about investigating the origins of the Russia investigation, the 2016 campaign, and illegitimate if it involves the Bidens? Is that the distinction he was this afternoon trying to create?
Right. I mean, let's be clear. There's only one thing that Mick Mulvaney walked back today, and that's the idea that this military assistance was conditioned specifically on looking into this DNC server and this conspiracy theory about Ukraine in 2016. But he still is not walking back the notion that restoring this military assistance was tied to getting the Ukrainians to investigate corruption. And we know from a whole parade of officials that have now been testifying before Congress that investigating corruption in Ukraine was basically a euphemism in the Trump administration for trying to dig up dirt on the Bidens, Hunter Biden, that could be used to help the president politically. We know that because Rudy Giuliani told it to a lot of folks, including Gordon Sondland, who testified today. So even with this walkback, even if you were to take Mick Mulvaney at face value that he somehow misspoke today, you still basically have Mick Mulvaney and the president, in their own words, doing most of Democrats' work for them by pretty openly acknowledging that there was a conditional transaction here that Democrats have been trying to prove.
Well, in his deposition today, we were also talking about this. Gordon Sondland said that Trump asked him and others to work with Rudy Giuliani when it came to matters related to Ukraine. He described that as the president's explicit direction, which Sondland said he agreed to follow. Sondland says that Trump withheld a presidential phone call or White House meeting until Ukraine issued a public statement committing to the investigations he was seeking. When it came to that statement, Sondland says that Giuliani, quote, specifically mentioned the 2016 election, including the DNC server and Burisma, the company linked to Hunter Biden. Sondland says he went along with the plan, even though he believed a meeting between Zelensky and Trump should be scheduled without any preconditions. Through all of this, Sondland said he understood that Giuliani spoke for the president, yet he said that at the time he did not know what was afoot. Quote, I did not understand Giuliani's agenda might have also included an effort to prompt the Ukrainians to investigate Vice President Biden or his son. Congressman, I saw one of your colleagues on our network a short while ago, Peter Welch from Vermont, say that it was his impression that Sondland had been duped by Rudy Giuliani and the president. Do you agree with that assessment?
So I can't get into specific testimony, but based on his opening statement, we don't know if he was duped or otherwise, but it's true that he basically was directed to go to Giuliani, who basically was apparently calling the shots on what was required by the Ukrainian government to get a meeting and get a phone call and so forth. So I think that this is really important because all along we've been saying that Giuliani appears to be running a shadow foreign policy. One that is not necessarily in the best interests of the United States, but what appears to be in the best interests of his private clients, whether it's Donald Trump or any of a number of cast of characters, in many cases questionable characters, who happen to be his clients, whether they're in Europe or otherwise.
Let me just follow up on that, because this has been the testimony that certainly has leaked into the press that we've been talking about before your committee over the last few days continues to point to this idea of a shadow foreign policy when it came to Ukraine being run through Rudy Giuliani. Mick Mulvaney was also asked about that today. He said his response was, you may not like that Giuliani was involved, but the president gets to set foreign policy and he gets to choose who to do it. What do you say to that?
That's fine. He can choose whoever he wants to be his foreign emissary. It's what they do. If they are basically acting in the best interests of the United States in accordance with our foreign policy interests, that's one thing. But if they are acting not in the public interest, but in favor of an individual or a client at the expense of the public interest, that's another altogether. So, for instance, with regard to Ambassador Ivanovich, he publicly was trying to get rid of this ambassador. And at the same time, he has these clients, now we know them to be Fruman and Parnas, who were recently indicted, who had reasons for this person to be removed. And so this is very bad, to say the least. It's very disturbing, and it just